Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be continuing on with Burn Your Wings. This will be part 15, chapter 15, entitled You're Next. Aizawa pulls out the file and places it on the desk in front of him. He had looked over it when he'd first gone over all the files, but while he'd paused on it, if only because the villain had a fire-based quirk, he had quickly passed over it, seeing it didn't mention any children in any of the incidents. He hadn't thought it was related to his problem child. But now he knows better. He stares down at the file. Villain name, Salamander. Quirk, fire-breathing. Charges, multiple incidents of assault, murder, attempted murder, and arson over the course of a year. Verdict, life sentence. The villain had been caught a full decade ago by Eraserhead. Unlike most villains, his motivation wasn't to pursue wealth, an agenda, or even some personal grudge. He just wanted to watch people suffer at his hands. But Salamander was no fool. He knew that if he targeted civilians or heroes, he would be put on their radar. So Salamander played it smart and only went after other villains and dwellers of the underworld. It's not like villains are going to be able to come knocking on the police station door and asking for help. After all, so it had taken the law over a full year to pin down Salamander. Some cases of buildings burning down and gangs being demolished have been traced back to the villain only after he'd been caught. The fact that his many crimes never included thievery and that he only targeted villains and other shady people is the biggest reason that the man had been able to get away with his crimes for so long. But Aizawa can see how some people, like Dabi, might have taken that as vigilantism instead of the cold, cunning calculation that it was. The picture on the file shows a man with snapping black eyes and curly black hair. Midoriya doesn't bear that much resemblance to the man at a first glance, but the subtlest similarities are there, if you know what to look for. There had been a lot of signs, if you knew what to look for. And that's just the problem. Aizawa saw them, but he hadn't known what they meant. Aizawa recalls the first day he'd met Midoriya in person. The kid had recognized him as Eraserhead just by seeing his face. Sure, some hardcore fanboy might have put two and two together after seeing Aizawa use his quirk, but there's a reason Aizawa is an underground hero, not to mention that he avoids the media like the plague when he can get away with it. That means Midoriya's familiarity with him can only come from a more personal interest. And Aizawa had not at all been prepared to deal with the absolute adoration and respect in Midoriya's big wide eyes. And there had been that quirk assessment test as well. Midoriya had been alarmingly unfamiliar with his quirk, especially compared to how naturally his peers used theirs. It's never a good sign when that happens, because quirks are supposed to be like any other part of your body, and Midoriya should have grown up using it and testing it like any other child. Actively repressing your quirk hints at major issues, not to mention Midoriya's casual lack of self-preservation, and the insane amount of pain tolerance to match it as well. Then Recovery Girl had told him about the scars. They were old, she had said. I'd say at least 5, maybe even over 10 years old. Treated by an amateur, too, and he didn't deny it when I guessed that he treated it himself, instead of getting proper medical attention. And they're not just from ordinary scrapes, those were knife marks. They were focused on the outside of his forearm, suggesting that he'd been trying to shield himself from someone larger wielding a knife. And Aizawa, that was just his left forearm. I didn't even get to see the entire arm, let alone the rest of his body, and I fear what I might find. After that revelation had come, and the absolute mess that the USJ had turned out to be, in the aftermath, Aizawa had noticed that Midoriya unconsciously calls him Eraserhead instead of Sensei, under stress, and that the kid is absolutely traumatized by the fire side of his quirk. For fuck's sake, Midoriya had apologized, after having almost single-handedly held off the 3 main villains. The signs had been there. Aizawa had seen them, had noted them, had been kept up at night worrying about them, but he hadn't known what they meant, and so he'd been completely blindsided when the truth had hit them with the delicacy of a freight train. A bad person. A villain. He was my father. And Midoriya had laughed, as if this was some black comedy that he should have been expecting this, as if thinking, of course this is my life. He had laughed and laughed and laughed, like he didn't know what else to do, like something had shattered inside of him, and laughing was the only way that he knew how to choke out the broken pieces. Beaten within an inch of death every day, Midoriya had said. If Salamander was arrested 10 years ago, that means Midoriya had been regularly and brutally beaten when he was only 5 years old, or God forbid, even younger. Aizawa thinks of all the small details, little tells, strange habits of Midoriya that he'd noted and filed away but not fully understood. Those memories swirl around his head like the fury of a howling blizzard. There had been a lot of signs, if you knew what to look for. Aizawa just hadn't understood what they meant. He hadn't, and now that he does, Aizawa has to consciously unclench his teeth and work his jaw. He forces his hands out of the death grip that they'd had on the ends of his capture weapon. He sits there staring at the file for a long, long time. Eventually, All Might comes looking for him. The hero pauses at the doorway to the office for a moment, watching Aizawa's slumped form with haggard and haunted eyes before he clears his throat. It's time to go. Aizawa nods and stands as he puts away the file in the locked drawer. Before he shuts it closed, he catches one last look at the file. His eyes linger on the part that made him unable to link Salamander to Midori in the first place. Name: Takahashi Hizashi. Family relations: none. Good evening, Midori-san. We're sorry to intrude, especially in current circumstances. Come in, All Might, Eraserhead. Unlike Salamander, Midori Inko's relationship with her son is instantly apparent in their resemblance to each other. They have the same wide green eyes, the same soft round features, and pretty much the same hairstyle. In regards to appearances, Aizawa and All Might have differed from their norms. Both are dressed in solid black suits. Aizawa is clean-shaven and has tamed his hair from the usual careless mess to something presentable, and All Might is using the little precious time he has to buff his body into his hero form. It's the very least they can do. Both heroes, both teachers, follow Midori Inko into a small living room. The two settle down on one side of the coffee table, while Inko seats herself on the other side and quietly pours some tea. All three of them are silent for a long moment, staring down at the steam swirling from the untouched tea. Eventually, it's Aizawa who breaks the silence. First and foremost, I owe you an apology. The hero, the teacher, the man, bows his head low. Not only was I there when Midori was severely injured again while under my care, but I didn't think to order him back to safety. So he went to protect Bakugo, even in his wounded state, and ended up in the perfect situation to get kidnapped. It's my fault. As it is mine. All Might is quick to follow. Even sitting down, he's much taller in his buffed-up form, but that only means that he lowers his head that much more. Midori was likely targeted, at least partly because of me. I couldn't hide my fondness for him, and that made him a target. We are so very sorry, Midori-san. Inko stares down at their bowed heads and looks at them for a long moment. Here is All Might, the #1 hero, and Eraserhead, the hero who liberated her and her son from Hizashi. Here are two people who, under almost any other circumstance, she would have been a nervous mess at meeting, and they're bowing their heads as low as they can to her, but right now she only feels empty, because no matter who these people are, Izuku is Inko's world. I don't know what to say, she finally admits in a hollow voice. I know that you're not to blame. I know that it's the villains' fault. I know that you two have already done so much for Izuku, whether you know it or not. At those words, Aizawa and All Might both wince. Inko watches them with an unflinching gaze. But that doesn't change the fact that my son is missing. Aizawa closes his eyes. All Might swallows thickly. He shouldn't say this, especially since Tsukuji himself had crossed a few lines when telling him in the first place, but faced with the hollowness in Inko's green eyes that are so much like young Midoriya's, he can't help but try to reassure her. The police have a lead, he tells her in a rush. They hadn't been able to track the signal from Shigaraki's phone call. Figures that the villain would only call when he knew the signal was jammed, but Tsukuji had found a potential hideout, and young Yagirozu had been able to place a tracker on the Nomu that had appeared. The police haven't announced it in hopes of making the villains complacent and taking them by surprise, but we have a solid lead. We're launching a rescue as soon as possible. Tomorrow, in fact. The only thing that we're waiting for is gathering all the heroes so that there's no chance of a failure. It isn't an excuse. I will save young Midoriya. It's a promise. Inko stares at All Might. His eyes, that are usually shadowed in his form, are all but burning with fervor. This is the #1 hero giving her his personal promise, and yet all she can do is nod numbly. Silence reigns once more, before Aizawa musters his will to bring up the one thing he wishes he didn't have to. I'm very sorry I have to bring this up, Midoriya-san, but the League of Villains now knows Midori's relationship with Salamander, Takahashi Hizashi. Inko's hands clasp around each other tightly. She'd been warned over the phone about this topic, so she knew it had to come up, but she still isn't prepared at all. She'll probably never be. They may try to contact him in prison or use him against you and Midoriya. If you can tell us anything about your husband—" "No," Inko cuts off sharply, raising her head fully for the first time. She gives Aizawa a surprisingly hard look. "I have so many regrets regarding Hisashi, not being able to see him for who he really was in the beginning, not being able to stop him, not being able to protect Izuku from him, not being able to just leave, but Hisashi was never my husband. That's the only thing I've never regretted." She slumps a little after that, as if the fight had gone out of her. Aizawa remembers what Midoriya had referred her to. During the video chat, he'd called himself Hisashi's son, but he'd never said Inko was his wife. No, he had put it as the person who was equivalent to his wife. Takahashi, Hisashi, and Midoriya Inko. Midoriya Izuku. It confirms what Aizawa had suspected once he digged up Salamander's file again and found the man's surname. "You weren't married then," he states more than asks. Inko shakes her head tiredly. "I lived with him. I had Izuku with him, but we were never legally married." She gives them a brittle smile. "I suppose you would want me to talk about him? About us?" "Only if you're all right with it, Midoriya-san." "It's not all right. It'll never be all right, but if it helps keep Izuku safe, then I'll do anything." Inko's breath hitches, and she lets out a watery laugh that's packed with guilt and self-deprecation. "I have to start sometime." She takes a deep breath and then lets it out slowly. Her eyes avoid both Aizawa and All Might again. Keeping her gaze fixed unseeingly on her tightly clasped hands, her nails dig into her plump flesh, but she doesn't seem to notice the slight pain. "I met Hisashi when I was 19, she begins quietly. "I had just lost my family, and he never had any. He was the only one who seemed to understand. So when he moved, I followed." Both Aizawa and All Might are deathly still, not even daring to breathe loudly as Inko digs up memories that she'd split so much blood and tears over. Some memories that she'd tried so hard just to bury. "We never made it official," she continues. "He never brought it up, and I never felt the need. I wondered if we should, when we had Izuku, but in the end, I decided not to. So I put Izuku under my name. Even if all three of us lived together as a family for all intents and purposes, there was never anything legally binding us. Hisashi was Izuku's father, but he was never my husband." Then Inko shudders, that self-loathing and guilt surfacing again. "But in the end, it didn't matter. Even if there was no strings officially tying me to him, I couldn't dare go against Hisashi when he changed. And Aizawa doesn't want to ask, he doesn't. But All Might looks too stricken to bite the bullet, and Inko looks too lost in memories. But they need anything and everything in order to protect Midoriya. So he swallows hard and forces the words through clenched teeth. "What happened?" Inko lets out a breath as if she'd been waiting for that question. "Hisashi started beating me," she quietly admits. Aizawa and All Might already knew this, of course, from Midoriya's unwitting reveal. It doesn't make it any easier to listen to, though. "It would have been all right if it was just me. I could have taken it if Hisashi only beat me. I locked Izuku in the broom cupboard so that Hisashi couldn't get to him, in hopes that at least he would be spared. But Izuku, he broke out and he stepped between us." All Might bites back the sound that threatens to make out of his throat. It sounds exactly like what his boy would do, but while it's the sort of thing that a natural hero would do, instead of making him proud, it makes him ache. Aizawa closes his eyes. So this is where his problem child's crippling issues, hero complex, abundant selflessness, willingness to sacrifice, lack of self-regard, low self-worth, astonishment at the care and acknowledgement from others. It all started here. Inko lets out a choked sob, tears starting to spill from her wide eyes. Again and again and again, Izuku took the beating for me every single time, and I couldn't stop either of them. She looks up at them then, and her eyes are bright with tears and wild with something bordering on hysteria. "Do you know how that feels? To watch the one good thing in your life risk his life for you time and time again because you couldn't do it for both of you?" And even in her state, even while tearing her heart out and bearing it to them, even when finally letting out the words that she'd buried like they're opening with the floodgates, Midoriya Inko is still quiet. Her sobs are stifled, and her breaths are choked, and her words are little more than a whisper. It shows just how much she'd been oppressed, just how much she's used to being oppressed. And it reminds both heroes, both teachers, both men who call Midoriya Izuku theirs in some way, my boy, my problem child, how Midoriya never shouts, how he's always hyper-aware of people's presence, how he can move as silently as a ghost, how he doesn't seem used to physical contact that isn't violent. The signs had been there, but neither of them had known what they meant. Inko curls into herself and shakes with near-silent sobs. Neither Aizawa or All Might can move to comfort her because her body language makes it clear that's not what she wants. Besides, what right do they have when they failed Midori Izuku as well? So instead of saying any futile comforts, this time it's All Might who swallows around the painful lump in his throat and is brave enough to ask, Aizawa, Eraserhead arrested Salamander a decade ago. That would have made young Midoriya 5 years old when it happened. Inko nods, choking on her tears. He was 3 when it began. Those softly whispered words punch the air out of Aizawa's and All Might's lungs. Inko raises her head. She doesn't even bother brushing away her tears. Instead, she looks both stricken heroes in the eye. I thought it was over, now that Hazashi isn't here, but Izuku's never been able to not help someone, even if it meant hurting himself. And as much as it breaks my heart, I can't stop him from doing what he wants to do. Not after I've utterly failed him. And I can't protect him either. But you two, you've already saved him. He's always looked up to you so much. You're his heroes, so please. Green eyes that are so much like Midori Izuku's bore into them. Be Izuku's hero again. Inko's breath hitches as her voice breaks, but her eyes are unyielding. Bring my son home. This can't be true. This can't be true. Salamander he couldn't have. Calm down, Dabi. We don't know anything for certain yet. I'm going to bust into prison and ask him myself. I said calm down, Dabi. The heroes are already on high alert because we took their precious prize boy. We can't afford to do anything drastic until things settle down. Aw, I understand, Dabi. When you like someone, you want to be with them. You want to kill them. Toga, you are not helping. Izuku barely hears the ruckus the villains are kicking up amongst themselves. His mind is filled with the sight that he'd glimpsed in the split second that Shigaraki had shown him the video call screen on his own phone. It was too dark, and too quick to make out everyone, and there were people in the background wearing what looked like police uniforms, but he's fairly certain that he saw the faces of some of his closest friends and All Might, and Aizawa. Every single one of them had looked absolutely horrified. Izuku winces again at the memory. Todoroki and Bakugo had already known that his father had been abusive, but neither of them had known that Hazashi had been an actual villain. Being a bad person is not the same thing as being a villain. And now they know. They all know. Izuku swallows thickly. He had never intended to tell any of them, especially not like this. He can't even imagine how they might be taking this, and, oh God, he never meant to tell them, never meant for them to find out. They trusted him. What will they think of him for keeping this a secret? What will they think of him for being the son of a... You! Suddenly Dabi is in Izuku's face, grasping his shoulders like an iron grip. He would have lifted Izuku clean off his feet if he hadn't been strapped down to the chair. Tell me the truth, the man hisses. Was Salamander really... Did he really... Izuku stares up at the villain with wide eyes. Dabi's lost control of his quirk in his agitation, and licks of flame are rolling around him, making a sharp contrast with his shaggy black hair. He isn't even breathing out the fire, and Dabi himself said that his hair color has died. But for a moment, Izuku sees Hazashi. Dabi flinches. Perhaps he sees the recognition and the fleeting fear in Izuku's eyes because he lets go of Izuku as if he'd been burned. He takes an unsteady step back, staring at Izuku, his eyes swirling with a mess of emotions. He works his jaw, but no words come out. And then he whirls around and storms out of the room. Dabi! Magne calls after him. Spinner makes to follow, but Shigaraki waves a hand at them. Let him be. He needs to cool his head. But the other villains eye the door uncertainly, but Shigaraki doesn't seem bothered in the slightest. If anything, he looks delighted. So, you're the son of a villain, huh? He grins from behind the severed hand, and Izuku flinches at the reminder. Shigaraki props up his elbow on the counter bar, and his chin in one hand, crossing an ankle over his knee, confidence and satisfaction radiating from his pose. I made a great choice calling them. You're never going to be a hero now that it's out. They won't want you back. No one wants to deal with that kind of baggage. Izuku opens his mouth. He wants to tell Shigaraki that he's wrong, that his friends are different, that his teachers know better, that they're good and kind and understanding. But he can't help but hesitate because somewhere inside him, a small, uncertain, utterly terrified voice whispers, "But what if?" And in this moment of hesitation, Shigaraki's lips stretch wide and utter the words that have been burned under Izuku's eyelids, and seared into the beating heart and have plagued his every hope and dream for the past 10 years. As they say, like father, like son. Hisashi laughs, and Izuku wakes with a start. He's breathless for a moment as he reorients himself and struggles to distinguish dream from reality, memory from present. Phantom laughter rings in his ears as it fades out. He takes a few quick, short breaths to steady himself. Izuku looks around to find that yes, he's still strapped down into the chair and the villains are lounging around the bar. Dabi is still absent since he stormed off the other day after the phone call, but everything else seems to be the same. Actually, scratch that. Izuku himself is very much not the same as he was before he dozed off. He looks down at his body to find that he's cuffed and strapped down. His gritty clothes have been changed, and something inside Izuku twinges painfully at that because Todoroki had given him that shirt, and he'd taken more comfort in it than he'd realized. And his wounds have been healed. Even his arms, previously shattered and mangled, are now miraculously put together. His muscles ache with fatigue when he experimentally rolls his shoulders, but the telling creak and shooting pain of broken bones is absent. "What did you drug me with?" is the first thing that comes out of Izuku's mouth, because no matter how exhausted he was, there's no way he would have just slept through someone touching him enough to change him and heal him. Not with how light a sleeper he normally is, and definitely not with how high-strung he is being trapped in a villain hideout. Magne waves a hand at him. "Relax, Pumpkin Pie. We only did a bit of drugs in your water to keep you knocked out for the treatment since you tried to run away the last time we untied you. Muscular messed you up too bad." "Well, you should see the other guy." Izuku can't help the quip that slips out between his clenched teeth. Izuku never thought of himself as talkative. He'd always been more of the silently defiant type when facing Hisashi's violence or Bakugo's bullying. But ever since coming to UA, he finds himself talking more and more in stressful situations. At first it had started as a deliberate, practical, and calculated tactic. Stalling for time, gathering information, provoking the opponent into making a move, bringing attention off of someone else and onto himself. But now he finds himself running his mouth even when he doesn't strictly need to. Izuku wonders if, at some point, it has become something as a defense mechanism. He brushes the thought away for the moment as Toga puffs out her lower lip and eyes him up and down. "But I liked you better with blood, and hey, if there's someone with a healing quirk, why don't we get to be treated?" She turns the question to Shigaraki. "What, were you hurt during the mission?" "I got a paper cut yesterday." Shigaraki makes a sound that's something between a sigh and a snort at Toga's indignant pout. He shrugs one shoulder and grumbles sulkily as if this is something that he, too, had complained about in the past. "Midori won't be any use to us if he's crippled, which is why he got a pass. Sensei usually won't let us unless we're critically injured. Says you learn from your mistakes that way." And at those nonchalant words, Izuku freezes. It had been pretty obvious that he'd been healed with some kind of quirk. There's no other explanation for his arms healing overnight. But it's the person Shigaraki mentioned so casually that makes his blood run cold. "Sensei," he'd said. There's only one person Izuku can think of that Shigaraki would call that. All for one. Izuku presses his lips together. He'd known that he'd have to face the villain, or rather the villain, sooner or later, given that he's the successor of One for All, but All for One is strong enough to have turned All Might into a shadow of what he once was capable of. Izuku is under no delusions that he's anywhere near ready to take him on now. Much less him and the League. That he's mentoring, I guess, at the same time. The door swings open and a familiar figure steps in, making Izuku grimace, and now there's one more person that he has to deal with. "Dabi! Hey, you can't just run out like that and expect a warm reception. Welcome back." Twice his typical conflicting speech aside, the rest of the villains greet their returned member. Dabi gives them a half-shrug and breezily apologizes for running off. Izuku notes that Dabi is very carefully avoiding meeting Izuku's eyes. "Took you long enough, but at least you came back in time for the show." Shigaraki grins, his chin in his hand and his elbow propped up on the bar counter, looking immensely pleased with all this. "The show? UA's holding an apology press conference. It starts in 5 minutes. Huh. Izuku hadn't heard about that. Maybe it came up while he was drugged. "I can't wait to see the press tear them a new one." "Think they'll talk about us?" "They will." Shigaraki grins as his eyes slide over to Izuku. "They will," he repeats, and Izuku realizes with a jolt that he's including Izuku in that us. He almost flinches away as if he's been physically struck, only refraining because he doesn't want to show any weakness. Shigaraki just grins at him. "This'll show you that you can't go back. You belong here now." Hisashi laughs. As if I've always said, boy, you can't reach the sun. You belong down here with me. Izuku's nails dig into his palms, but then he consciously unclenches his fists as well. Great, I guess I'm not getting any popcorn, Izuku drawls dryly, perhaps going a tad overboard on the biting response. Like he was saying, defense mechanism. Do I at least get a bathroom break before the show begins? Shigaraki sighs as if wounded, but he's grown used to Izuku's flippant remarks over the days. He waves a hand at the Miss Villain. Kurogiri, and Dabi, you two go with him and hurry back. We don't want to miss this. Me? Dabi blinks, still not looking at Izuku. Magne makes a shooing motion at them. Consider it punishment for bailing on us. You're on babysitting duty now. For a moment it looks like Dabi's going to refuse or pass on the chore to someone else, but for some reason he eventually stalks towards Izuku and helps Kurogiri unbind him from the chair. He's still not looking directly at Izuku. Izuku quietly follows the two out. Dabi's strange behavior aside, he didn't snide and banter with Shigaraki just for an actual bathroom break. On the first day of imprisonment, Izuku had shown that he'd rather face the entire league minus Kurogiri and Shigaraki than take his chances against the warp villain, so then on the league made the point in always keeping Kurogiri and his warp quirk close and on watch duty. Suffice to say, Izuku hasn't made an inevitably futile attempt to escape since. It looks like the villains are keeping up on their caution, even after 2 days of Izuku's good behavior, and since Izuku had thrown around Kurogiri like a rag doll, there had always been another villain with Kurogiri. This time it looks like it's going to be Dabi, who's a logical choice since he's a long-range fighter. It actually makes a lot of sense, considering how Shigaraki keeps going on about games. This positioning is almost like a game tactic. With Kurogiri and Dabi watching him, it only makes sense for Izuku to behave like all the other times Izuku had been taken to the bathroom these past few days. But the thing is, Izuku had never been truly defeated. He'd been waiting, and now that his injuries are healed, well, even if Kurogiri is here, he's still willing to make a gamble. Izuku raises his cuffed hands to his head as if to scratch the back of his neck, keeping his movements carefully nonchalant. The pair of villains don't pay him any mind, and so Izuku discreetly slips a bobby pin out of his bun. He wouldn't have been able to do this when his hands were broken and swollen, but his newly healed hand is able to deftly hide the pin between his fingers as he lowers his arms. His heart is pounding. This is the best chance that he's had so far, but he has one shot at this. He can't afford to mess up. Can't be found out before he's ready. He hunches his shoulders and stretches his hands down low as he can, trying to keep them out of sight as possible. You know, he opens his mouth, and this time it's deliberate distraction tactic. Dabi is still avoiding looking at him, but Kurogiri's gaze is fixed on his face now, even as he prods Izuku to keep walking. I used to get locked up in the broom cupboard a lot. He sees Dabi flinch at his words out of the corner of his eye, but Izuku never breaks eye contact with Kurogiri and keeps talking, trying to keep the villain's attention on his mouth and away from his hands. Kurogiri narrows his eyes out of the blue subject, but he doesn't notice the way Izuku's fingers are subtly wrestling the pin into the lock on his handcuffs. Izuku gives him a winning smile. As you can imagine, I hate being locked up. Kurogiri seems to be losing his patience with Izuku's seemingly random rambling. A small click sounds from below, and Izuku's lips stretch even further over his teeth into a savage grin. Which is why I learned to pick locks. Wait, what? And as the handcuffs clatter to the ground, Izuku pulls Kurogiri's neck piece towards him. The villain jerks forward, and Izuku wraps his newly freed hands around the armor, with speed and strength enhanced by full cowl. Then, before any of them can do any more than make a sound of surprise, Izuku pushes condensed flame out of his palms, mimicking Bakugo's blast. The small explosion of fire hits Kurogiri's neck point-blank, targeting the one piece that he's corporeal underneath the armor, and the villain goes slack from the pressure and shock. Izuku drops him as soon as he's unconscious. He has to move quickly. His ambush succeeded because he had the element of surprise, and because Kurogiri had grown complacent after Izuku's feigned good behavior these past few days. With his warp quirk out of the way, Izuku's chances of escape have been heightened drastically, but he still needs to deal with Dabi before the villain calls the rest of the gang. Izuku whirls around to face the other fire quirk user, his mind in overdrive, his heart pumping, and his arms come up into a fighting stance. Dabi just stands there, staring at him. For a long moment, both of them are frozen in place, both of them waiting for the other to make a move. Dabi is finally looking straight at Izuku, and Izuku pants slightly, waiting for an opening. Eventually it's Dabi who moves first, but it isn't to attack Izuku. He steps out of the way. Take a left at the end of the hallway. The villain tells a shocked Izuku, gesturing towards the hallway behind him and keeping to the wall to give Izuku a clear path. Then 2 rights. The door on the left will lead to the back alleys. Izuku blinks at him, taken aback. Dabi had started out as one of the villains with the most determination to convert Izuku, and then there had been that mess about Hisashi, and now he's helping him escape? Why? Izuku asks warily. Dabi avoids his eyes again. I don't know, he says finally. Just go. I'll let you go this time. Izuku eyes him suspiciously, but figures this probably isn't some elaborate trap. Even if it is, he can always punch through a wall now that his arms are healed up and uncuffed anyway. He hesitates one last time before he takes a step forward, though. He wrestles with himself, and then cautiously offers, You could come with me, he suggests quietly. From what he's gathered from listening to the villains talk these past few days, unlike the others, Dabi hadn't committed any crimes prior to joining the League. If he really joined because he believes in some good purpose, then maybe... But Dabi's gaze snaps up at that. No, he denies viciously. Just like you refuse to be a villain, I will never be a hero. And Izuku sees the steel in his eyes and the venom in his tone. There is a story behind Dabi's hate for heroes and idolization of vigilantes, Izuku's sure, but it isn't his place or his business to ask about, and, frankly, it ranks far below get the hell out of here on his to-do list at the moment, so Izuku just nods in acknowledgement. After all, Izuku himself had this whole world shaken too when he had found out that Endeavor hadn't been the man, the hero that he thought he was. It hadn't shaken Izuku, yes, but in the end it hadn't shaken his conviction to become a hero in his own right. It looks like Dabi is the same. He warily takes a step forward, and Dabi just shuffles further to the side, raising his hands in a clear indication that he doesn't intend to do anything. Izuku keeps his eyes on Dabi as he walks forward, but just as he passes the older man, Izuku lights up with full cowl and whips around, striking the villain's neck with a precise jab in a move that was stolen from Eraserhead. Dabi follows Kurogiri's lead and hits the ground like a sack of bricks before he knows what hits him. Because while Izuku is desperate enough to accept help from a villain, he isn't dumb enough to risk trusting him. This time, Dabi had said, he'd made no clear promises about the next time that they meet or even 5 minutes later. Izuku's about to bolt down the hallway now that the immediate threats are dealt with when a smash shakes the entire building. Sounds of crashing, yelling, and general chaos echo up from the bar that he'd just left. Izuku hesitates. On one hand, it looks like the villains are distracted by whatever just happened. He can use this opportunity to try that door that Dabi mentioned, and even if it's a trap, he can always sacrifice an arm and punch through the walls to get the hell out of here. But on the other hand, there's only one person he knows that can make that kind of a smash. As if to cement his decision, a tremendous roar sounds through the hallways. Where is he? Izuku's heart skips, though not in fear. He's never heard that voice so much filled with rage, but he'd know it anywhere. The dark corridor lights up with full cowl as Izuku dashes back to the bar. He slams the door open to find the bar area a mess. The far wall had been demolished. There are branches restraining the villains, and heroes are spilling in from the hole in the wall, but Midoriya, my boy! There is a sort of desperate relief in the hero's voice as he calls out to him. Izuku's breath catches as his eyes zoom in on the figure standing in the middle of the room. It's All Might. It's the number 1 hero. It's his hero. And Izuku feels like he's going to cry. All Might, if just barely laid eyes on each other, hands reaching out despite the distance between them, when a black, inky substance bursts out of Izuku's mouth. Both Izuku's and All Might's eyes widen. All Might springs towards him, arms reaching out to catch him in a familiar embrace, fear and desperation contorting his face. My boy! And the black ink spreads violently and swallows Izuku's entire body, then disappears without a trace. All Might is left staring at his empty hands. No! Young Midoriya! Ah, welcome, Midoriya. All for one. Caring for someone doesn't naturally come to Shoto, but his mother, the one person who had been affectionate to him, had also rejected him with all her might, and then they had been forcefully separated. He was never allowed to play with his siblings when he was younger, and by the time that Shoto grew enough of a backbone to openly defy Endeavor, they had all grown too awkward around each other. Even with his peers, Shoto was always treated as Endeavor-san rather than Shoto. Shoto isn't used to being close to someone, not to mention that his social skills are near non-existent, and so, when Shoto found himself looking after, and just plain looking at Midoriya, no one had been more surprised than Shoto himself. On one hand, this wasn't like Shoto. But on the other hand, this was Midoriya. So he had caved to his new impulses, and truthfully he had never put up much of a fight in the first place. It had felt more like succumbing to gravity, like a moth drawn to a flame. And watch Midoriya, using any and every excuse to reach out to him. Texting him out meaningless things, helping Midoriya hide his scars, using his quirk to ice things over or heat things up, staying up beside Midoriya and just sitting together in silence. All of it was so new and strange to Shoto. He hadn't received care in a long time, and he wasn't sure how to give it. He knew that he's socially inept and that his attempts at looking after Midoriya were awkward at best, so he hadn't been able to shake off the feeling that he was going to mess up his bumbling attempts one day. But Midoriya never waved him off. He always looked pleasantly surprised and then would beam at Shoto with so much gratitude and appreciation that it made Shoto's breath stutter and make his heart feel like it would burst. "You're going to spoil me rotten," Midoriya had grumbled half-heartedly, thankful and playful and so unbearably fond. "How would I manage without you?" But the truth is, the real question had never been how Midoriya would manage without Shoto. It was how Shoto would manage without Midoriya. And now he knows the answer. He can't manage without Midoriya. He can't. It's different with Kirishima and Yaoyorozu, even with Bakugo or Ida or Uraraka. Kirishima isn't exactly one of Midoriya's closest friends, as he usually sticks with the louder classmates, but both of their winning personalities mesh well when together. Plus, the two had been growing closer recently, what with Kirishima teasing Midoriya about his growing fame. Likewise, Yaoyorozu interacts more with the other girls, but that doesn't mean she's immune to Midoriya's gravity. "You aren't the only one worried about him," Yaoyorozu had said at the training camp. "Bring him back safe." And Shoto had failed. Bakugo had been the one to propose the rescue mission in the first place. According to Kirishima, the blonde had even said please and called Yaoyorozu by her name, just for a chance to find Midoriya. Someday, Shoto is going to stop being surprised and remember that, despite their differences, Bakugo and Midoriya are childhood friends, and they have stuck together with each other for at least an entire decade. Ida tried to keep up a front and insist that they should stick to the rules, putting up a token of protest, but he had caved a little too quickly to have been honest. He insists that he's tagging along as a watchman, but everyone knows that he's just as desperate to save Midoriya as the rest of them. Uraraka has known Midoriya even before school started. Shoto has hardly really been able to be regaled of the full story of how they met, and puked in synchronization at the entrance exam. Both she and Ida had been practically glued to the hip with Midoriya from day one, but it's still different. They want to rescue Midoriya. Shoto has to. It's why he's so restless when it turns out that the hideout Yaoyorozu's tracker led them to houses an army of Nomu, but no signs of Midoriya or anywhere. Even when some pro-heroes show up and mention that All Might is at another ambush site, while some of his classmates breathe a sigh of relief, Shoto is still unbearably anxious. Don't get him wrong, he isn't arrogant enough to think that he'd be any more help than the number one hero, nor is he selfish enough to insist that he has to be the one to save Midoriya. He's glad that All Might is rescuing him, but there's still an apprehensive uneasiness, an inexplicable wariness that plagues him. Logically, Shoto knows there's no place safer than by All Might's side, but he probably won't be able to breathe easily until he actually sees Midoriya, safe and sound. Shoto closes his eyes, trying to center himself. His hands clenched, the phantom sensation of having Midoriya in his arms still haunting him. He's just about to resign himself and suggest they move out when it happens. Something is here. The unofficial rescue squad lean against the wall in frozen terror. Something demolished the entire building. The pro-heroes have been blown away like leaves, and they can't breathe. It's like that time with Stain, only 10 times worse. A malicious aura presses down on them, choking them, rooting their feet. Shoto knows they need to run away, but none of them, not him, not Uraraka, not even Bakugo, can manage to take a step. Cold sweat drips down Shoto's neck as he barely manages to crane his neck enough to peek through a crack in the wall. Someone in a black suit and headgear is walking out of the ruins of the building, but then he beckons with one hand and a black substance appears in front of him. A small figure bursts out of the inky substance. "Ah, welcome, Midoriya." "What?" Shoto's eyes widen. Yes, that's Midoriya. Coughing out black ink, dressed in different clothes, wounds healed up, eyes bright with wild panic. It's Midoriya. Shoto had always wondered how Midoriya is always able to move when others are frozen in fear. Now he understands. If your fear for someone else is stronger than your fear for yourself, then Shoto can move too. He's about to run forward, all logic and rational thought abandoned, in his instinctive and overpowering need to hold Midoriya, when a hand shoots out and grabs him. Shoto looks over to find Yaoyorozu looking at him with pleading eyes. She's reaching over to Uraraka to hold on to him, effectively trapping Uraraka too, which also happens to have been about to run off as well. On the other side, Shoto finds that Kirishima is holding on to Ida and Bakugo with both hands, going so far as to harden himself with his quirk to restrain them. Yaoyorozu shakes her head, pleading with her eyes. Shoto bites his lip. He knows she's right. They just saw what that man is capable of. They have no chance if they just blindly run up to him, but Midoriya is there. Shoto has to do something. He has to. Smash! Izuku shields his face against the blast of wind as All Might shoots down from the sky like a comet and slams into All for One. Despite the situation, Izuku finds himself staring in awe as All Might and All for One exchange hits, meeting each other blow for blow. Out of the corner of his vision, he catches Shigaraki similarly entranced, his posture slack in near disbelief at the sight of their respective mentors. A clash of titans. It's breathtaking in its fearsomeness. "Let's go, Shigaraki," Compress calls over the whipping wind. Both Izuku and Shigaraki start, coming back to their senses. All for One had gathered all the members of the League along with Izuku. The villain had forced Kurogiri's warp gate open and provided them with an escape route. And with All Might occupied with All for One, the League only has to take Izuku with them to secure a victory. Izuku gulps as the conscious members of the League all turn to face him. Even with Kurogiri and Dabi still knocked out cold, it's still 6-on-1. "Take Midoriya. We're getting out of here." Well, shit. "Midoriya, my boy," All Might calls urgently, but All for One takes advantage of the moment that the hero turns his head to Izuku to strike a devastating blow. All Might just barely manages to block it. "Don't worry about me," Izuku yells as he flips backward with full cowl, narrowly avoiding Toga's knife. "I'll manage." Izuku isn't confident in his claim at all, but it's the least that he can do for All Might. At this rate, he's going to be nothing but a distraction to him, and with Izuku in the vicinity, the hero can't even go all out. He needs to get out of here, but the villains are desperate to catch him too. What can he do? What can we do? We can't fight. I know, so what can we do? The students hiding behind the wall hiss furiously as they watch Midoriya evade the League of Villains. All Might and the masked villain are keeping each other busy, but that still leaves 6 villains chasing after Midoriya in a deadly game of tag. Midoriya is just barely keeping out of reach, cleverly combining all of his quirks to evade the clutches of the villains and keep them away, but it's only a matter of time before his stamina runs out, or he makes a mistake. Shoto clenches his fist. What can they do? Izuku pulls himself away from Magne as he pushes a burst of flames towards Compress, forcing the villain to jump back. With Kurogiri out of commission, Compress is the one that he has to watch out for the most. But that doesn't mean the other villains are pushovers. "Got him! Lost him!" A strangled choke leaves Izuku's mouth as twice measuring tape wraps around his throat, but he manages to burn through it and free himself before the other villains can close in. The villains are backed into a corner, too, while before they'd wanted to keep Izuku's injuries to a minimum so they could recruit him, even going so far as to heal his arms. Now they're prepared to take him by force. A flitting thought has Izuku baring his teeth in a grin. Looks like he made the right choice when he knocked Dabi out. He doesn't think the villain would have stood aside this time. What would Deku do? Shoto turns his eyes from watching Midoriya. The others all turn to Uraraka as well, and the girl raises her head to meet their gazes with steely eyes. Deku would have come up with a plan, she states, faith and conviction resounding her words. There must be a way that we can help without breaking the rules. I refuse to believe there isn't, so think, what would Deku do? Izuku violently pivots to the side, just barely dodging Shigaraki's destructive fingers. Spinner and Compress are closing in on him from each side, so he chooses the lesser of two evils, jumping towards Spinner, and then he kicks off the villain like a springboard, launching himself to the air. He flares his fire like a shroud as he touches the ground again, trying to keep the villains at a distance. Toga bursts through the flames, wielding her knife in a maniac smile. "Let's go, Izuku-kun." Yaoyorozu, the next time Midoriya is sufficiently far away from the villains, shoot a flare to distract them. Uraraka, make the charge team light with your quirk. Kirishima can break through the wall with his hardening, and then Ida's engines and Bakugo's blast will give you momentum. I'll create a path with ice, and when we get high enough, we'll have to call Midoriya. You do it. Everyone pauses in their rapid planning to turn to look at Bakugo. Bakugo ignores them and stares at the person that he singled out with unreadable red eyes. Deku will come to whoever calls, but we can't afford a single moment of hesitation, so you do it. A bright flare streaks across the sky. What? The villains are momentarily distracted, and in the chaos something bursts out and flies over the battlefield. Huh? Is that? Izuku's eyes are wide in shock as he sees people that shouldn't be here. Is that Ida? Bakugo? Kirishima, too. He, along with the League, in a kind of gaping up in surprise when he spots Todoroki's movements amidst the gang. Despite the distance, their eyes lock onto each other with unerring accuracy. Midoriya! Todoroki reaches out a hand to Izuku. Come on! If it was anyone else, Izuku might have had thoughts like, what's going on, or how are they here, or even, what the fuck, but because it's Todoroki, none of those thoughts even register in his mind. Todoroki is calling him. Then Izuku can't help but answer. There's no hesitation or even time for conscious thought when Izuku pulls himself and pushes his fire while leaping with full cowl. Just like that first time at the sports festival, he takes Todoroki's hand and Todoroki pulls him up. Izuku laughs wild and disbelieving. How would I do without you? Todoroki has a strange expression on his face, like he wants to cry and laugh at the same time. That's the wrong question, he whispers, but his words are lost in the whistling wind. Mount Lady and Gran Torino fend off the League, and at last they're able to dash away from the battleground. The group skid to a stop in an abandoned alley, panting for breath. Deku! Izuku turns at the call to find Uraraka and Yaoyorozu rushing towards them. Only then does Izuku get the chance to properly look at the people who saved him. Todoroki, Uraraka, Ida, Bakugo, Kirishima. Oh, they're the ones who saw that video. They're the ones who know. Izuku gulps. He can't dare say a word to them. The fear and anxiety that had been forgotten in the moment rushes back like a tidal wave, crashing into him with enough force to knock him unsteady. Izuku knows his friends are good people, but what if? What if? He kept this a secret for them for so long, and this is just a small secret. No, it's... What will they think of him for keeping it from them? What will they think of him for being the son of a... Uraraka lets out a sob, and then she throws herself at him. Izuku just barely manages to catch her, stumbling a little in surprise. Uraraka doesn't ask any questions, doesn't accuse him of anything, doesn't reject him. She just wraps her arms around his torso and hugs him tight. I'm so glad you're okay, she sobs, and suddenly Izuku feels like he could cry too. Something tugs gently at his hand, and Izuku looks down to find that he's still holding Todoroki's. Todoroki uses it to pull Izuku and Uraraka, who's still hanging on to him for dear life, closer to him, and then he snakes his other arm around Izuku's waist, hugging him from behind, as he drops his head onto Izuku's shoulder. Ida lets out large sniffles, and is that a fake mustache? And uses his larger body to his advantage to fling his arms around all three of them and just hug them all. Kirishima laughs out loud, pulling Yaoyorozu and a grumbling Bakugo into the group hug as well. They're a mess of limbs, shaking from sobs and laughter, but not even Bakugo tries to pull away. Izuku just stands there, speechless, astonished, sandwiched and surrounded and embraced by his friends. They don't ask about Hisashi. They don't care about Hisashi. They only came for Izuku. Izuku feels like his heart is swelling to the point of bursting, and he feels like he could laugh or cry for days. He feels... Izuku squeezes his hands and arms, and the hand in his squeezes back, and the arms around him tighten their hold. He finally lets himself relax for the first time since the villain showed up at the camp 3 days ago. He smiles. Thank you. Those brats, Gran Torino shakes his head. I'm betting your recklessness rubbed off on Midoriya, and his recklessness rubbed off on them. It's a vicious cycle. That tenseness, a tight smile, it comes out of Toshinori despite the situation. Both Midoriya and Shigaraki's gang had escaped, leaving only Toshinori and Gran Torino facing against All for One. The two stand opposed to the villain and raise their fists. The villain tips his head to the side. It's hard to tell what he's thinking with that mask covering his face, but words and tone are as condescending as they were 6 years ago. I only came to save Tomura, but if you want to fight, then I can only reciprocate. After all, I despise you. Toshinori bristles at those words. Is that why you took young Midoriya? To hurt me? All for One hums at Toshinori's accusation. It was actually Tomura who had suggested it, not I. The villain idly flicks one hand to the side. Tomura is still much like a child. While that means that he has the potential to grow, it also means that he can be stubborn and impulsive. But children oft grow defiant if you tell them no, so I let him do as he pleased. The plan to recruit that violent friend along with him was actually quite ingenious, if it had only worked. If nothing else, Midoriya is the type of person who can't leave someone behind, and the Bakugo child would have been an excellent shackle. As young Midoriya already said, young Bakugo would never be a villain, All Might defends. All for One merely shrugs. Perhaps, but regardless, the plan failed, and the Vanguard Action Squad could only secure Midoriya. Tomura and the others may have hoped to coerce him into vigilantism, but I knew better. I've seen 8 generations worth of wielders of One for All, after all, and Midoriya Izuku is cut from much the same cloth. He would rather break than bend. So what? This was all some convoluted lesson for your protege? Gran Torino spits. Oh no, All for One denies airily. It was also to let Tomura get acquainted with the next wielder of One for All. Having a decent adversary can be very motivating, after all. I would know. And, despite the lack of a visible face, All for One spears the 2 heroes with a piercing gaze. His tone cools and pools with acid. Though 8 generations' worth is a little too persistent. So if you ask, taking Midoriya was personal? If it was to hurt you? And again, somehow they can feel the wide grin stretching across the villain's lips without seeing it, then yes. Yes, it was. But even with All for One doing his utmost hardest to shatter his resolve, even when his true form is revealed to the world, All Might is still the #1 hero. He is still the symbol of peace. He's still a pillar of hope, and he will not crumble. In a way, I'm grateful for this fight. I'm grateful that it's me here fighting you, not young Midoriya. I'm grateful for this chance to end the cycle before it reaches him. I'm grateful that I haven't failed my successor yet, and I will end you, right here, right now, so that you can never lay a single finger on my boy again, so that you can never lay a sight on him again. And true to that promise, soon All Might stands on his ruins of Kamino Ward with the defeated All for One at his feet. He thinks of All for One. He thinks of One for All. He thinks of his successor. He thinks of his boy. Then he points to the camera and he says, "You're next." The public explodes, while the crowd roars and cheers, taking his message to be addressed to the villain populace. The students who formed the rescue squad turn to look at Midoriya. Midoriya Izuku staring up at the screen with tears streaming down his face, and his hand clutching to his chest over his heart. But his back is straight and his head is held high. And they know, in that moment, exactly who All Might's message was for. Just like the world will soon enough. The world will start to make comparisons between a young speech from a young man at UA's famous sports festival as he announces words that we're next, and they'll make side-by-side comparisons to that of All Might's speech, claiming you're next. Arguments will arise on who exactly it is that All Might is speaking to. This concludes Chapter 15 of Burn Your Wings. Chapter 16 will be up next, and as always, thank you all so much for listening.